Hello and welcome back to the Wasteland, everybody. Welcome back to Fallout, where today we're once again going to be looking at the history of one of the special stats. Today we're going to be taking a look at Perception. And Perception has had some really high highs and some really low lows throughout the history of Fallout as to how useful it has actually been. Unlike Strength that we covered in just the last episode, where Strength has been pretty consistent throughout the games. If you wanted to go with a melee or an unarmed build, it was always good to take Strength. If you wanted to carry around a lot of stuff, Strength was always a great stat to have. Perception, on the other hand, started out as arguably one of the best special stats in the games, got even potentially better as the games kind of continued, and then took a hard nosedive. So let's start out with Fallout 1, 2, and Tactics, where these games are the most similar, so they're going to be lumped into one. Perception in these games would give you quite a few different bonuses. Now, this governed a couple different skills. This covered First Aid, Doctor, Lockpicking, and Traps. Those skills wouldn't really remain in the future games, where Doctor and First Aid were two different stats in the original games. First Aid was basically for bandaging yourself up with medical kits, so it was good if you didn't have any sort of status effects on you. Doctor could heal more severe injuries, like if you had gotten winded, if you got a concussion, if you had a crippled limb, then a doctor's bag would be necessary for you to do that or to talk to a doctor. The main downsides to both these, though, is that you could actually injure yourself when trying to heal yourself. You could potentially fail as well, which would take a charge from either your doctor's bags or your medical kits, which could be bad because you didn't always get a lot of those and they were fairly expensive to actually buy. So in the early game, this could be pretty rough, but if you had high levels of First Aid and Doctor, you could potentially subvert using other type of healing like your stim packs or healing powder so that you could heal yourself. These would later be condensed into just one skill of medicine, which is probably for the best. Lockpicking would remain the same pretty much throughout all the games, although in the older games it was simply just a skill check. If you passed it, then you got through the lock. If you didn't, then you failed and could either try again and keep trying, or you could potentially jam up the lock and you couldn't open it at all. And then traps in the older games were for actually searching for traps, as well as setting traps and disarming traps. This could be useful if you knew that there was traps in an area, if you knew there was landmines or something, or if you knew that certain chests or something were rigged with explosives. You could search them ahead of time with traps, and if you found something, then maybe you would disarm it. Sometimes you'd set it off and damage yourself, so that would be potentially bad. This was also how good you could set traps, because in the old game you could actually screw up setting down a trap, not have the correct timer on it, or just to have it go off immediately on you. So traps could be very dangerous for you to use, but if you did have high trap skill, you could potentially disarm and arm very dangerous weapons for the enemy, assuming that they were willing to walk over it. On top of that, Perception also aided in combat quite a bit, where it determined how accurate you would be at a particular range. Weapons had a certain amount of range in the older games. You could fire at an enemy so long as you were within that range. But this depended on whatever skill you had, whatever this weapon was, whether it was a small gun, big gun, or energy weapon, or throwing weapon. That would give you a percentage chance of hitting the enemy, as well as your perception would also make it more likely to hit. The more perception you had, the more likely this was at further away. So Perception was actually quite good in these early games, especially in something like Fallout Tactics, where it really helped multiply your range overall. And in that game, you were commanding a whole group of 6, and you were trying to fight multiple enemies. So being able to attack the enemy and engage the enemy before they could engage you, at least accurately, that would certainly help. So Perception was arguably one of the best special stats to be just pumping just simply for the range stats. If you were going with melee or unarmed, Perception wasn't as good, although this also somewhat determined the sequence of when you and the enemy got to go. So basically, if you had high perception as well as like high agility, you had a higher chance of going first over the enemies, assuming that you didn't initiate the conflict or whatever it might be, and then end your turn and then wait for their turn. You probably wouldn't get another turn after that, but you were more likely to go before they could, which was generally really good. On top of this, Perception in the old games was affected by a few of the traits. Gifted, which we've already talked about, which just gave +1 to all traits, which was really good. And then Night Person in particular affected this, which just gave you more perception when it was at nighttime. This was fine. It could be kind of useful, and nighttime did actually affect how well ranged you had in the early games too. So this one would kind of offset that if you wanted to take it, but it wasn't a crazy trait either way. Night Person has never really been a crazy trait or perk in any of the Fallout games. This would also have some very useful perks for it in the early games, like Awareness, which just allowed you to see what the enemies were using and how much HP they had. That was actually a really big bonus in the early games, and it was one of the first like level 3 perks. Better Crits, which it would be known for, bonus rate of fire, which was really strong, as well as some other really good ones like Sniper, which was like an endgame perk. It was really good, at least in the very first Fallout. It would then later be bugged in Fallout 2 and Tactics, so it wouldn't be as good, and then Sharpshooter, which was also really nice. So you had some really good perks, and there was definitely an incentive to put a lot of points into Perception, assuming that you were running a guns build of any sort. It would stay that way in Fallout 2, where it would basically not really change. There was a few other perks that you could get with it, but nothing really to talk about. Fallout Tactics was the same way. It was really nice to have really high Perception. Then it would take a heavy nosedive as we traveled into Fallout 3 and Fallout New Vegas, where Perception was arguably the second worst special stat in those games, at least for any sort of combat purpose. So in Fallout 3, Perception now governed explosives, lockpicking, and energy weapons, which is all fine. Like, those ones are all really good skills. Explosives wasn't as good in Fallout 3, it got a whole lot better at New Vegas just because you had more options with it, but lockpicking was always nice and energy weapons was always nice. The only extra thing that Perception gave though was actually just being able to mark enemies out on your compass further away. So if you had higher Perception, you could see enemies marked on the map a little bit quicker than you otherwise would. A lot of the time that didn't matter in Fallout 3 and New Vegas because it was pretty obvious if you could hear an enemy or if you could just physically see an enemy. If you're out in the middle of the desert, it's going to be pretty easy to see enemies directly in front of you or, you know, scanning around where they're probably going to be coming from. So having extra Perception would rarely actually affect this. I'd probably just set it at 1 in Fallout 3 and New Vegas if it didn't have a very, very useful perk associated with it, which is Better Crits. Better Crits really props up Perception. Light Step is kind of useful too, so those two skills, but the other ones that Perception has don't really matter that much. Better Crits does though, where it gives you 50% more crit chance, and in Fallout 3 crits were insane. So a lot of the time Perception would just be sitting at 5 for me, and then I get +1 to this thanks to something like Ant Sight. That would give me the 6 that I would need to actually get that perk. If I was going with an explosives build where I didn't care about crits, or some melee or unarmed build that didn't really care about crits, then I probably wouldn't take any Perception. It doesn't really help all that much. In New Vegas, it's pretty much the same situation where it didn't really get any new perks that help it. It still has some of the same good ones where like Better Crits, Light Step, and Sniper are really the main 3 that you're going to be going for. It did get a trait associated with it in New Vegas though, and that is 4 Eyes, so if you're wearing glasses, you get +2 temporary Perception at the cost of -1 permanent Perception. That one's probably the worst trait in the game because -1 to a special stat permanently is not good, even if it is Perception, which isn't a great special stat to begin with. But then just putting on glasses to get a +2 increase or a +1 effectively on it doesn't really matter all that much. Perception just doesn't help all that much. And the main reason why you want any Perception is just simply so that you can get those perks. There is a common misconception that it helps with accuracy and VATS in Fallout 3 and New Vegas. That's not true in those games, but it was kind of true in the older games, at least in effective range, and it would become true in Fallout 4. So moving on to Fallout 4, Perception would get changed a bit more, and it would be a bit more useful than it would be in the previous 2 games, because now Perception did help VATS accuracy, so if you're going to the VATS build, this would be very useful at shooting at range, and now it would have the perks associated with it like all of the special stats in Fallout 4, so you could pump this up higher. Starting out, you had Pickpocket for just stealing stuff, which could be useful. Definitely useful in the early game if you want to get a lot of money quickly. Rifleman, which was probably one of the best damaging skills in the game because a lot of the strongest weapons in Fallout 4 were semi-automatic rifles. Awareness would actually make a comeback, although it would be substantially worse in Fallout 4 than it would be in the previous games. It's okay, but nothing way crazy. Locksmith, once again, for just picking through certain locks. Kind of cool, but there's no unique loot behind locks anywhere in Fallout 4, so that's not really necessary. It's just a nice quality of life thing to have. Demo Expert, which would be really strong. It would be very nice just so that you can buff up your explosive damage, assuming that you're using explosive weapons or you happen to get a legendary weapon with explosive on it. You had Night Person, which once again still wasn't good, so you probably wouldn't take it, at least not right away. Refractor, which was really bad. It just reduced the amount of energy damage that you took, but most enemies didn't use energy weapons. so it wasn't great. Sniper, which made semi-automatic weapons with scopes even better, so you just wanted to throw that on there. You also had Penetrator, which was really good because you could punch right through power armor and hit the power core, or hit the fusion core on those. So it did become very, very useful there. And then you also had Concentrated Fire, which was good for a VATS build because it just increased your accuracy. Perception would be okay to be building up at least a decent amount in Fallout 4, probably at least up to the point of Sniper. It did get a lot better from Fallout 3 and New Vegas into 4, but it's not as strong as it used to be in the older games, where it was arguably one of the best special stats. Next up, we're going to be taking a look at Endurance, which that one has had an interesting history too, so I hope you guys enjoyed this one. Thank you guys so very much for watching it. Tell me your thoughts on Perception, and I will talk to you guys next time.